There are phrases that don't hurt. There are phrases that resonate. And there are phrases that a Scorpio keeps forever, not because they're resentful, but because they sense the intention behind each word even before processing its meaning. You've probably heard that Scorpios are too intense, that they hold grudges, that they're difficult to deal with. But almost no one realizes Scorpios don't react to words. They react to what's beneath them. And there are 3 specific phrases, 3 combinations of words that seem innocent, that sometimes even sound like affection or advice, that activate something very ancient within a Scorpio, something they can barely explain, but that they feel immediately in their chest. A kind of silent alarm, an instant recoil. It's not drama. It's not oversensitivity. It's a perception system trained throughout life to identify what is truly being said, even when the words say something else. You'll understand exactly what happens inside a Scorpio when these phrases appear, and perhaps you'll also understand why they act the way they do, why they remain silent when they should speak, why they distance themselves when they should get closer, why they never forget certain conversations even when they pretend to have forgotten. It starts with something everyone has said without thinking, something that seems harmless. But for Scorpio, it's almost a silent declaration of war. The first sentence is, "You're being too dramatic." It seems simple, it even seems like a common observation. But when someone says this to a Scorpio, what they hear isn't the phrase itself. It's the real message beneath. What you feel isn't valid. What you perceive is an exaggeration. You're wrong about your own experience. Scorpios don't reach emotional conclusions by chance. Before expressing anything, they've already gone through a long internal process, checking if it was real, if it had any basis. When you finally speak intensely, it's because you're certain. So when someone dismisses this with, "You're being too dramatic," it's like saying that Scorpio's entire internal system, all that sharp perception, all that ability to sense what's between the lines, is a flaw, an excess, a problem to be corrected. What happens isn't visible anger, it's something more subtle and lasting. He closes a door, not out of anger but out of self-preservation. He decides at that moment that that person doesn't have access to what's inside, and that decision is rarely revisited. Because for Scorpio, trust isn't a permanent state, it's something that's built slowly and crumbles in seconds. And the phrase, "You're being too dramatic," is the kind of thing that really breaks things. What lies beneath that statement is not criticism, it's invalidation. And invalidation is precisely what Scorpio learned very early on to recognize and protect itself from. But there's a second sentence. This one is more treacherous, because it comes wrapped in an appearance of care. You need to learn to let things go. This phrase appears during moments of conflict, hurt, and processing. Someone looks at Scorpio while they are still carrying something, a situation, a betrayal, a pain, and says this with the best of intentions, as if the problem were the memory, as if the solution were forgetting. But Scorpio doesn't hold on to things by choice. They hold on to them because they understand that every experience has weight, and that ignoring that weight doesn't make it disappear, it just makes it reappear in a different way, at a different time, with a different face. When someone says, "Let it go," Scorpio hears, "You're wrong to feel the way you feel." The right time for you to process it isn't your time, it's the time others deem reasonable. There's something Scorpio knows instinctively, even if they've never put it into words. Real transformation doesn't happen when you ignore what hurts. It happens when you go deep enough to understand what it means, and only then can you truly move on. Letting go without understanding is not healing, it's suppression, and Scorpio has a very refined sense for the difference between the two. It was while searching for answers to this that I found this digital book. The Divine Path that guides your zodiac sign to a life of purpose talks about Scorpio's ability to go deep and how to transform that depth into clarity, direction, and real purpose, not as a technique but as a posture, a way of being that uses Scorpio's intensity as a strength, not as a burden. If you're processing what you've just heard, if you've recognized something in yourself that you've never been able to name before, this is exactly the right time to move forward, not tomorrow, when the clarity fades. Now. The link is in the first pinned comment, but be aware this content may be taken down. Click now and download your copy. Tell me in the comments, which of these phrases have you heard and felt like something closed up inside you? You don't need to explain much. Sometimes a single word says it all. The third sentence is the most complex, because it doesn't come from enemies. It comes from people close to us, from people who like Scorpios, and yet it hurts in a way that the others don't. Why can't you be simpler? Simple, as if depth were an inconvenient choice, as if existing intensely were a decision Scorpio makes every morning upon waking, and that they could simply abandon if they wanted to. There is a fundamental misunderstanding in that phrase. It assumes that there is a lighter version of Scorpio hidden somewhere, waiting to be released, and that what prevents this version from appearing is stubbornness, or lack of effort, or some trauma that has not yet been resolved. But Scorpio isn't complex because something went wrong. It's complex because that's its structure, because it processes things on multiple layers at the same time, because when it looks at a situation, it can't just see the surface, it also sees what's underneath, what's behind it, what might happen next, what's probably not being said. This is not a design flaw, it is the design. And when someone asks him to be simpler, what they're really asking is for him to be less himself, for him to cut out entire parts of how he perceives the world in order to be more comfortable being understood. Scorpio tries. At some point in their lives, almost every Scorpio has tried to express themselves more directly, less densely, less burdened. And what happened was that they felt partially invisible, physically present, but absent in what truly mattered. Because you can't simplify perception. You can simplify expression, you can choose what you say and what you keep to yourself. But what Scorpio sees, feels, and processes internally doesn't have a volume control. And the real weight of that phrase isn't in the demand to be different. It's in the implicit message that the way he is, naturally, is too much for the people he loves. This is what remains. Not the phrase itself, but its echo, the idea that being completely oneself is a risk that can push away those who are close. And that's where Scorpio begins to split, not dramatically, silently and gradually. One part of him appears to the world, another part remains guarded, protected, accessible only to those who have undergone a long and rigorous internal screening. This division isn't a lack of authenticity. It's survival. It's the result of having heard many times that the whole version is too much. But what happens after this division sets in? What does Scorpio do with the parts of themselves they've learned to hide? The cost of this division doesn't appear all at once. It accumulates in unexplained weariness, in relationships that always remain at a certain level and never go beyond that, in a feeling that there's something very real in you that no one has truly seen yet, not because you're too mysterious, but because you never seemed secure enough to show it. This question has an answer, and it begins exactly where you least expect it, not in what Scorpio hides, but in what he still chooses to show, even after everything. Because there is something that Scorpio guards with a care unlike anything else. Not out of fear, but because he knows somewhere very deep down that this something deserves protection. What you've just understood, that Scorpio is divided for survival, not by choice, and that this division carries an emotional cost that accumulates silently, is one of the most important truths about this sign. And the digital book, The Divine Path That Guides Your Zodiac Sign to a Life of Purpose, works with this tension. what Scorpio keeps hidden and what it can safely and purposefully bring to light, transforming this depth into real direction instead of carrying it as a silent burden. If you've ever felt that the entire version of you is too much for where you are, this book was written for you. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last copies are running out. Click now and begin your journey toward the clarity and genius you deserve. What Scorpio hides most carefully isn't the hurt feelings, it isn't the difficult memories, it isn't the betrayals they never forgot but pretended to have overcome. What he hides most carefully is hope. It seems strange to say this about a sign that is often described as cynical, distrustful, and closed off. But that's exactly it. Scorpio has a capacity for hope that goes beyond what most people can sustain, and that's precisely why they protect it so carefully, because they already know, better than anyone, what happens when you place your hope in the wrong place. He's lived through this experience before, maybe more than once, maybe many times, and each time hope was misplaced, in a person, in a situation, in a future that didn't materialize, Scorpio didn't forget. He learned, he updated his internal system, he became more selective, not as self-punishment, but as recognition that hope, for him, is too precious a resource to be wasted. And this is where the three phrases we opened this video with cause damage that goes far beyond what it seems on the surface. When someone says, "You're too dramatic," they're not just discarding Scorpio's emotion, they're discarding the perception that fuels their hope, the ability to read situations deeply, to feel what's underneath, to trust their own internal system. When someone says, "Learn to let go," they're asking you to release precisely the process that allows you to transform experience into wisdom. The process that converts pain into understanding, and understanding into the ability to hope more intelligently next time. And when someone says, "Why can't you be simpler?" they're asking him to cut away the complexity that allows him to see the world in multiple layers. The same complexity that allows him to identify in advance when something is worthwhile and when it's not. Taken together, these three phrases undermine precisely what Scorpio most needs to keep intact in order to function well: confidence in their own internal system of perception. And when that confidence fades, when Scorpio begins to believe that perhaps the version others ask for is actually better, something changes, not visibly, deeply and silently. He begins to distance himself from himself, not all at once, in thin, almost imperceptible layers. A small concession here, an adaptation there. A phrase he didn't say because he calculated it wouldn't be received the right way. An emotion he swallowed because the space didn't seem safe. Until at some point, he looks inside and finds a strange silence where before there was certainty. It's not emptiness, it's distance. Distance from oneself. And that's the kind of estrangement that costs more than any lost relationship. But there is a way out. And it doesn't involve being different. It involves truly understanding what's happening and why this pattern makes sense for a Scorpio who has learned that showing off is risky. This inner detachment that Scorpio experiences when it begins to doubt its own perception is one of the central themes of the digital book, The Divine Path that guides your zodiac sign to a life of purpose. It doesn't treat this process as weakness. It treats it as a turning point, a moment when Scorpio can consciously choose to return to itself and use everything it has experienced as fuel for purpose, not as proof that something is wrong with it. This return begins with understanding, and understanding begins now. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last copies are running out. Click now and begin your journey toward the clarity and genius you deserve. There comes a moment in almost every Scorpio's life when they stop, not dramatically, internally and completely silently. A moment when they look at the pattern, at the phrases they've heard, the doors they've closed, the parts of themselves they've learned to keep hidden, and realize they've carried all of this alone for too long. It's not a collapse, it's clarity. A clear understanding that the tiredness he feels is not weakness. It is the accumulated weight of years functioning with a part of himself always in protective mode. Of years silently processing what should be processed aloud. Of years translating his own intensity into something more palatable to the world around him. And in this moment of clarity, Scorpio has a choice that few signs are forced to make with such awareness. To continue adapting or to begin building a life where adaptation is not necessary. I'm not talking about isolation. I'm talking about the opposite movement. Going so deep within yourself that you emerge knowing exactly what is yours, what isn't, and what you're no longer willing to carry. Scorpio possesses a transformative capacity unlike any other sign, not because it's special in a superior sense, but because nature itself has trained it to get to the bottom of things, to not stop at the surface, to not accept the superficial version when a deeper truth is available. And this ability, which sometimes seems like a curse, sometimes called drama, excessive complexity, an inability to let go, is actually the most powerful tool he possesses. Because the same depth that makes you suffer more intensely is what makes you transform more completely. The same perception that makes you hurt more is what makes you understand more. The same intensity that pushes away those who aren't ready for it is what creates bonds that last for decades when you find someone who is. The Scorpio paradox is not a problem to be solved. It is a creative tension to inhabit, and inhabiting it consciously, instead of trying to erase or suppress it, is what separates a Scorpio who suffers in silence from a Scorpio who transforms in depth. Because the difference isn't in what happened to him, it's in what he decides to do with what happened, whether he'll carry it as proof that the world is dangerous or as raw material to build something that only he, with all his depth, would be capable of building. This transformative capacity that is a hallmark of Scorpio, the same depth that hurts and heals, that distances and connects, is exactly what the digital book, The Divine Path That Guides Your Zodiac Sign to a Life of Purpose, intentionally helps to direct. Not to soften Scorpio, not to make it simpler or more palatable, but so that it uses this power consciously, building a life that corresponds to the true dimension of who it is. If you've made it this far, you already know it's not about being less. It's about being whole in the right place. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last copies are running out. Click now and begin your journey towards the clarity and genius you deserve. So the next time someone says one of those 3 phrases to you, and someone will, because the world is still learning to live with those who go all in, you'll have a choice. You can contract it. You can close another door. You can file away yet another piece of evidence that it's safer to keep it to yourself than to show it. Or you might recognize at that moment that the phrase says much more about the person who said it than about the person who heard it. That "you're too dramatic" is the observation of someone who has never learned to trust their own emotional system. That "learn to let go" is the advice of someone who confuses letting go with understanding. That "why can't you be simpler" is the question of someone who has never felt what it is to perceive the world in real depth. Scorpio doesn't need approval to be intense. It doesn't need permission to be profound. It doesn't need an explanation to be complex. What he needs, however, are places where these things aren't excuses, where depth is welcome, where intensity is recognized for what it truly is, not excess but presence, not a problem but power. What hurts Scorpios isn't being overwhelmed. What hurts them is having spent too much time in spaces that are too small for the size of what they carry inside. But when you're in the right place, with people who understand what's beneath your words, even before you finish the sentence, that's when you understand why it was worth keeping it to yourself. Why it was worth waiting. Why Scorpio's longer path always leads to something the quick path never reaches. Because Scorpio didn't get here by accident. Every door he closed, every silence he chose, every time he decided to keep things hidden instead of showing them, it was all part of a refinement process, of knowing, with ever greater clarity, what is worthy of receiving what he carries. You're not too much, you just haven't found enough yet.